It started with the late nights. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sarah had always been social. She had her book club, her yoga group, and the occasional girls' night out. But lately, her evenings away had become more frequent, and her explanations felt thin. "It's a networking group," she'd say, kissing me on the cheek as she grabbed her bag. "Just a few of us women getting together to talk business and share ideas. It's empowering." I'd nod and force a smile, even as a strange unease settled in my gut. Networking wasn't exactly Sarah's thing. She was a teacher, for God's sake, not someone with a career that demanded late-night strategy sessions. One night, she came home well past midnight, her hair slightly mussed and her cheeks flushed. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but really just waiting for her to walk through the door. "You're up late," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "How was it?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then smiled. "It was good. Productive. I think we're really building something great." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But something about the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach twist. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. "What kind of project is this, exactly?" I asked as we sat at the breakfast table. Sarah shrugged, pouring herself another cup of coffee. "It's hard to explain. We're brainstorming ways to support each other, financially, emotionally, that sort of thing. It's all about empowerment." "Sounds intense," I said, watching her closely. "Are you sure you're not starting a revolution?" She laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Maybe. You'll just have to wait and see." I smiled, but inside, the unease was growing. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, but something about her recent behavior didn't add up. The long hours, the vague explanations, the way she'd been more protective of her phone lately. It all felt off. That night, when Sarah left for another networking session, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I followed her. I waited 10 minutes after Sarah left before grabbing my keys. I told myself it wasn't paranoia, it was curiosity. She'd been so vague, so evasive, and the nagging voice in my head wouldn't let it go. I needed to see where she was going, to confirm that everything she told me was the truth. Keeping my distance, I followed her car through the dimly lit streets of our suburban neighborhood. She drove with purpose, no hesitation, like she'd done this route a dozen times before. I half expected her to head to one of the usual spots, a cafe, a friend's house, somewhere familiar, but she didn't. Instead, Sarah took a turn onto a less traveled road, one that led toward the industrial district on the edge of town. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I followed her deeper into the quiet, shadowy streets. Eventually, she pulled into the parking lot of an unmarked building. From the outside, it looked like an old warehouse, its windows dark and its walls covered in peeling paint. The only sign of life was the row of cars parked out front and a faint glow coming from inside. I parked a block away and killed the engine, watching as Sarah stepped out of her car. She was dressed sharply, heels, a fitted dress, hair neatly styled. She looked more like she was heading to a high-end cocktail party than a networking meeting. She walked to the side entrance of the building, where a man in a suit greeted her. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear before he opened the door and let her in. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the building and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. This wasn't the kind of place Sarah would usually go. It didn't fit. I debated whether to leave or go inside. My gut told me to stay out of it, to turn around and forget I'd seen anything. But curiosity, and something darker, pushed me forward. I slipped out of my car and approached the building cautiously, staying in the shadows. As I got closer, I could hear faint music coming from inside, a low bass line that pulsed through the walls. I circled the building, looking for a window or an opening where I could see what was going on. Finally, I found a small window near the back. The glass was frosted, but I could make out shapes moving inside. There were people, dozens of them, milling around in what looked like an upscale lounge. The dim lighting and the glint of crystal glasses in their hands painted a picture of luxury and exclusivity. I couldn't see Sarah, but I knew she was in there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening inside that building, it wasn't what she told me. I crouched by the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was nothing like the networking group Sarah had described. The dimly lit lounge oozed exclusivity, with its sleek leather couches, shimmering chandeliers, and people dressed like they'd stepped off the pages of a high-fashion magazine. The music was low but rhythmic, a seductive hum that seemed to draw everyone into its orbit. Waiters weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and cocktails. Groups of people huddled in corners, their laughter too light, their movements too close. I felt a strange mix of dread and fascination. This wasn't a workspace. This wasn't a casual gathering of women brainstorming ideas. It was something else entirely. I shifted, trying to get a better angle, and suddenly caught a glimpse of Sarah. She was sitting on a couch near the center of the room, a champagne flute in her hand. Her body language was relaxed, her posture confident, and she looked different. It wasn't just the dress or the makeup. It was the way she carried herself, the way she laughed at something the man sitting next to her said. And that man, I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was leaning in too close, his hand resting casually on the back of the couch behind her. They looked comfortable together. Too comfortable. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more information before I jumped to conclusions. I circled the building, searching for another way to see inside. As I rounded the corner, I spotted a side door propped open slightly, likely to let in some fresh air. I hesitated, then made my way toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened into a narrow hallway, dimly lit and lined with closed doors. I could hear muffled voices and the occasional burst of laughter coming from the lounge at the end. I moved cautiously, my footsteps light, and peered around the corner. The lounge was even more surreal up close. The people weren't just chatting. They were flirting, touching, leaning into each other with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. Sarah was still on the couch, and now the man next to her had his hand on her knee. She didn't pull away. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The woman I thought I knew, the woman who'd kissed me goodbye with a smile just hours earlier, was sitting there with another man, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. I pulled back into the hallway, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and I felt a sudden urge to storm in and drag her out of there. But I stopped myself. Whatever was happening here, I needed proof. I took out my phone, creeping back toward the lounge and angling the camera through the crack in the door. I snapped a few photos of Sarah, the man next to her, the way his hand lingered on her leg. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew in my gut. This wasn't just a club. It was a place for secrets, for people who wanted to escape their real lives and indulge in something forbidden. And Sarah was one of them. I left the building as quietly as I'd entered, my mind racing. The drive home felt like a blur, the streetlights passing in rapid flashes, but I barely noticed them. All I could see was Sarah on that couch, her laugh, her body language, the way she allowed that man's hand to linger on her leg. By the time I got home, it was late, but the house was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch in the dark, staring at the photos on my phone. The proof was there, staring back at me, Sarah's betrayal in vivid detail. But what I didn't have yet were the answers. Why? How long? And who else knew? The next morning, Sarah came downstairs, her usual bright smile plastered on her face. "Morning," she chirped, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said, keeping my tone even as I sipped my own coffee. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You all right?" "Fine," I replied, not looking at her. Just a lot on my mind. The guilt in her eyes was faint but there. Or maybe I was imagining it. Either way, I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I knew exactly how to play this. Over the next couple of days, I kept my cool, even as Sarah continued her usual routine. She still left for her networking meetings, still smiled at me like nothing was wrong. But now, I noticed every little detail. The way she hesitated before answering questions, the way her phone was always close by, the quick glances she exchanged with Lisa during family dinners. I needed more information. That's when I remembered something. Lisa had mentioned that she'd attended one of these networking events once before. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now the memory felt like a flashing neon sign. Lisa. She was the key. That evening, when Sarah went to the grocery store, I called Lisa. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful. Hey, Mark. What's up? Hey, Lisa, I said, keeping my tone light. Quick question for you. Sarah's been talking about these networking meetings she's been going to. You went to one, right? There was a pause, just long enough to make me suspicious. Yeah, she said finally. Why? I was just curious, I said casually. She's been so vague about it. What's it like? Oh, Lisa said, her voice suddenly too casual. It's just a group of women talking about career stuff. Pretty boring, honestly. I only went once. She was lying. I could hear it in her voice. Got it, I said, pretending to believe her. Thanks for filling me in. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, my suspicions confirmed. Lisa knew something, and she was covering for Sarah. But why? The following evening, when Sarah left for another meeting, I decided to confront Lisa in person. I drove to her apartment, knocking on the door and forcing a smile when she answered. Mark, she said, surprised. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. About what? About Sarah. And these meetings, I said, closing the door behind me. I know they're not what she says they are. And I know you know, too. Lisa's face went pale, her eyes darting to the floor. I don't know what you're talking about, she said weakly. Don't lie to me, Lisa, I said, my voice firm. I've seen the place. I've seen what goes on there. And I've seen Sarah with another man. She sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. Mark, I didn't want to get involved. It's not my place. Not your place? I said, my anger rising. You've been covering for her, haven't you? Helping her lie to me? She didn't answer, but the guilt on her face said it all. How long has this been going on? I demanded. Lisa hesitated, then finally muttered, a few months. I felt a fresh wave of anger wash over me. And you just went along with it? Let her destroy our family while you sat back and said nothing? I didn't know what else to do. Lisa cried. She's my sister, Mark. I couldn't just throw her under the bus. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Lisa's loyalty to Sarah had made her complicit in the betrayal. And now, it was up to me to decide what to do with that information. I left Lisa's apartment with more questions than answers, my anger simmering just below the surface. A few months, she'd said. Sarah had been lying to me for months, sneaking around and using her sister as an alibi. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a deliberate, calculated deception, and the more I thought about it, the harder it became to keep my emotions in check. But I wasn't done yet. Lisa had confirmed my suspicions, but I needed to hear it from Sarah herself. I needed her to admit what she'd done, to explain why she'd chosen to destroy everything we'd built together. When I got home, Sarah was already in bed, her phone on the nightstand and her expression peaceful as she slept. It felt surreal, seeing her so calm, so unaware of the storm brewing around her. I stood there for a moment, watching her, and felt a strange mix of love and hatred. The next morning, I decided to confront her. Not with anger, not with accusations, at least not yet. I wanted to see how far she'd go to keep lying to my face. Morning, I said as we sat at the kitchen table, the kids already off to school. Morning, she replied, smiling as she sipped her coffee. How was your meeting last night? I asked casually, watching her closely. She hesitated for just a moment, barely noticeable, but I caught it. It was good, she said, forcing a smile. We made a lot of progress. Really? I said, leaning back in my chair. That's great. What kind of progress? Her smile faltered slightly, and I could see the gears turning in her head. Oh, she said, waving her hand. Just brainstorming ideas. Nothing too exciting. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. You've been working so hard on this project. I was thinking maybe I could come to one of these meetings, see what it's all about. Her face froze for a split second before she recovered. It's just for women, she said quickly. You wouldn't really fit in. I chuckled, keeping my tone light. Fair enough. I'm just curious, you know? You've been spending so much time on it lately. She relaxed slightly, her smile returning. It's important to me, she said. I'm glad you're supportive. Supportive. The word felt like a slap in the face. She really thought I didn't know. That evening, when Sarah left for another meeting, I decided it was time to confront her. I waited for her to come home, sitting in the living room with the photos and texts I'd gathered spread out on the coffee table in front of me. When she walked in and saw me sitting there, her smile disappeared instantly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Sit down," I said, my tone calm but firm. She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the couch. Her eyes flicked to the table, and I saw the color drain from her face when she realized what she was looking at. "Do you want to explain this?" I asked, gesturing to the photos and texts. She stared at them, her hands trembling. "Mark, Don't lie to me," I said sharply. "I've been to the club. I've seen what goes on there. And I've seen you with him." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I said, my voice rising. "For you to betray me? To lie to me? To drag Lisa into your mess?" She flinched at the mention of her sister. "It wasn't like that," she said desperately. It just happened. I was feeling stuck, like I wasn't enough, and Eric, I repeated, the name hitting me like a blow. "So it's Eric." "Of course it is." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He made me feel alive again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Alive?" I said bitterly. "You think this is about you feeling alive? What about me? What about our kids? Did you even think about us while you were off with him?" "I did," she sobbed. "I thought about you every day. I hate myself for what I've done, Mark. I hate it." "Good," I said coldly. "You should." She broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the room. But I didn't feel sorry for her. I couldn't. Not after everything she'd done. Sarah's sobs filled the room, but I just sat there, staring at her like she was a stranger. It was surreal. This woman I had built a life with, the mother of my children, reduced to tears in front of me because of her own choices. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel love. I just felt done. When her cries finally subsided, I spoke, my voice cold and steady. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" She shook her head, wiping at her face. "I thought I could fix it before it got this far." You thought wrong." I cut her off. "You thought you could have your fun, keep your secrets, and I'd just stay here like an idiot, none the wiser. But guess what, Sarah? You were wrong." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything," I said, standing up and pacing the room, "because there's nothing you can say that will undo this. Nothing you can say that will make me forget the image of you with him." She flinched, her shoulders trembling as fresh tears fell. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. "And Lisa," I continued, my anger flaring again. "She knew, didn't she? She was helping you this whole time, covering for you, lying for you. How could you drag her into this?" "She wanted to help," Sarah said, her voice small. She thought what?" I snapped. "That this was okay? That betraying your husband and your family was something worth supporting?" Sarah had no answer, and the silence between us grew heavy. I walked over to the photos and texts on the table, picking up one of the receipts. "You know what this is, Sarah? It's evidence. Evidence that you lied to me, cheated on me, and made me feel like a fool in my own home." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to do what I should have done the moment I realized something was off," I said. "I'm filing for divorce." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "Mark, no. Please, don't do this. Don't throw everything away." "I'm not throwing anything away," I said, my voice firm. "You did that. You made this choice, not me." She stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped back. "Mark, please," she begged. "Think about the kids. Think about our family." "I am thinking about the kids," I said. And I'm not going to let them grow up in a house built on lies. They deserve better than this. And so do I. Her face crumbled, and she sank back onto the couch, defeated. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Regret, maybe? But it wasn't enough to change my mind. The next few days were a blur. I contacted a lawyer, gathered all the evidence I had, and started the divorce process. Sarah tried to talk to me, to plead her case, but I refused to engage. The only conversations we had were about the kids, who would take them to school, who would pick them up. Everything else was handled through our lawyers. Lisa, unsurprisingly, disappeared from the picture entirely. I didn't hear a word from her after our confrontation, and I didn't care to. She was just as guilty as Sarah, and I wanted nothing to do with her. As for Eric, I debated confronting him directly, but ultimately decided against it. He wasn't worth my energy. Let him slink back into whatever hole he'd crawled out of. The hardest part was telling the kids. I kept it as simple as I could, explaining that Mommy and Daddy wouldn't be living together anymore, but that we both loved them very much. My daughter cried, and my son asked a million questions I didn't have answers to. It broke my heart, but I knew it was the right thing to do. When Sarah moved out, the house felt emptier, but it also felt lighter. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I was angry. I was hurt, but I was free. After Sarah moved out, the house felt quieter, but it also gave me the space I needed to think. Anger, betrayal, and frustration boiled inside me, and I couldn't just let it go. I knew I had to protect my kids and myself from any further damage Sarah or Lisa might try to cause. But I also wanted to make sure the truth came out. I wasn't looking for petty vengeance. I wanted accountability. Sarah had not only betrayed me, but also roped her sister into her lies. And Eric? He wasn't walking away scot-free, either. If they thought they could upend my life and move on like nothing happened, they were sorely mistaken. The first step was to solidify my case for custody. I met with my lawyer again, bringing every piece of evidence I had. The photos, the texts, the receipts, and even Lisa's reluctant confession. My lawyer was meticulous, building a rock-solid argument that showcased Sarah's poor judgment and lack of respect for our family. "This will put you in a strong position," she said, flipping through the documents. "The court tends to favor stability, and your evidence paints a very unstable picture on her side." But it wasn't enough for me to just win custody. I needed to make sure the truth came to light. That's when the idea struck me. What if I exposed their secrets to the people they cared about most? I started with Eric. I knew where he worked. He was a mid-level manager at a local company. It didn't take much digging to find his social media profiles and figure out who his fiancée was. That's right, fiancée. The man who destroyed my marriage was engaged to be married himself. I debated for a moment, wondering if I should contact her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she deserved to know the truth. I sent her an anonymous message, attaching a few photos of Eric and Sarah together. I kept it short and to the point. "You don't know me, but you should know what Eric has been doing. These were taken while he was engaged to you. Do with this information what you will." Within hours, I got a reply, "Thank you for telling me. I had no idea. I'll take care of this." Eric didn't know it yet, but his double life was crumbling, just like mine had. Next, I turned my attention to Lisa. She'd always prided herself on her squeaky clean reputation, acting like she was the voice of reason in every family situation. But I knew the truth. I sent an email to a few key people in her social circle, colleagues, friends, even her boss, detailing her role in covering for Sarah's affair. I attached a few screenshots of text between her and Sarah, just enough to make it clear that Lisa wasn't as innocent as she seemed. I didn't expect much to come of it, but a week later, I heard through the grapevine that Lisa's boss had called her in for a discussion about her behavior outside of work. She'd lost the trust of her friends and colleagues, and her carefully constructed image was beginning to crack. As for Sarah, I let the legal process do the heavy lifting. The custody case went to court, and my lawyer laid out everything. The lies, the deceit, the impact it had on our family. Sarah's lawyer tried to paint her as a struggling mother who'd made a mistake, but the evidence was too damning. The judge ruled in my favor, granting me primary custody of the kids. Sarah would have visitation rights, but the terms were strict. and she was required to attend counseling before any overnight stays were allowed. When the ruling came down, Sarah looked devastated. She approached me outside the courtroom, her eyes pleading. "Mark, please," she said quietly. "Can we talk? Just us?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. This is what accountability looks like, Sarah. Get used to it." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked away without another word. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control again. The chaos was finally settling, and the people who had betrayed me were finally facing the consequences of their actions. After the courtroom victory, life didn't immediately snap back to normal, but it was the first step in rebuilding. The kids and I moved back into a routine, slowly piecing together what had been broken. The house felt different without Sarah's presence, a little emptier, but also freer. The first few weeks were the hardest. My daughter would ask when Mommy was coming home, and my son, younger and more oblivious, seemed confused by her absence. I explained it to them as gently as I could, sticking to the truth without overwhelming them. "Mommy and Daddy are living in different houses now, but we both love you very much," I tell them. It became a mantra, one I repeated until I almost believed it myself. Sarah, to her credit, complied with the court's rulings. She showed up for her visitation hours, attended the counseling sessions, and didn't try to undermine the custody agreement. But every time I saw her, there was a weight between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been lost. Lisa disappeared entirely. She moved out of state, avoiding the fallout of the chaos she'd helped create. I didn't care to track her down or hear about her life. As far as I was concerned, she was part of the past, and the past was where she belonged. As for Eric, the whispers about his ruined engagement reached me through mutual acquaintances. His fiancée had ended things the same week I sent her the evidence, and he'd been forced to take a leave of absence from work. I didn't feel sorry for him. If anything, I was glad to see him face the consequences of his actions. But revenge, satisfying as it was, didn't fill the void. It didn't erase the betrayal or the pain. What it did was give me closure, a way to put the pieces back together and start focusing on what really mattered. My kids and myself. I threw myself into being the best father I could be. Weekends became sacred, filled with trips to the park, movie nights, and pancakes on Saturday mornings. I started taking better care of myself, too, hitting the gym, eating healthier, even picking up a new hobby. Woodworking became my therapy, a way to channel my energy into something constructive. The garage, once a place tainted by secrets and lies, transformed into my sanctuary. I built tables, bookshelves, even a playhouse for the kids. Each project felt like a small victory, a tangible reminder that I could create something new out of the wreckage. Months passed, and the anger began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. I didn't miss Sarah, not the version of her who had lied to me, who had betrayed me. I missed the person I thought she was, the life I thought we had. But even that was starting to feel like a distant memory. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the kids play in the yard, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. The chaos, the heartbreak, the betrayal. It had all shaped me, but it didn't define me. The kids ran up to me, breathless and laughing, their faces glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. "Daddy, come play with us," my daughter called, grabbing my hand. I smiled, standing up and letting them pull me toward the yard. In that moment, everything felt simple, pure. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again, and that was enough.